The area where we were heading in Eastern Europe was known for its radioactivity. We had received reports of strange animals, things that looked like they were hatched from a mad scientist laboratory. I didn't know how much of it I believed, because some of the descriptions the survivors gave sounded more like Wendigo and dogmen than any real animal. I figured that in the heat of the moment and under attack, their minds had likely twisted the true form of the animals, as horrifying as they were, into something truly nightmarish. There were 3 of us heading into the dark Eastern European forests. My friend Dimitri, who was originally from the country and knew the language, his girlfriend Anna, and myself. Everything seemed mundane enough as we flew into the country and handed over our passports. There was no sign of the terrors waiting ahead. The first towns that we had encountered looked idyllic enough as we drove through them in a rental car. Isolated farmhouses with cows and chickens dotted the landscape. Plentiful fields of wheat, potatoes, and corn stretched out on all sides of us. The black earth here was fertile, I knew. As we headed deeper into the radiation zone, however, the houses and farms all started to look abandoned and dilapidated, the fields barren and dead. Christ on a cracker, I muttered, more to myself than to my friends. This place looks like it suffered through the apocalypse. It did, Dimitri said grimly. A nuclear apocalypse. I feel like the biblical one is far more optimistic than the true apocalypse will be. In reality, there is no rapture, no victory of light over darkness. If there ever is a World War III, every major city will be consumed by nuclear fire. It will throw buses and cars thousands of feet into the air, spilling out bodies onto the burning skies. Entire streets will collapse, trapping countless millions under the rubble. Well, that's a cheerful thought, Anna commented, her dark blue eyes staring out the window. I saw the reflection of white eyes skittering through the brush outside. Small animals that disappeared in front of the approaching roar of the engine. How far is it? I asked, feeling car-sick and anxious. The winding roads here curved through countless hills. It reminded me of driving through parts of Northern California before, when I had retched out the window. Anna and Dimitri seemed unaffected though. I cursed my stomach, which was always turning traitorous towards me. It's a while, man, Dimitri said. This country is huge. Probably another 3 or 4 hour drive, and then we have to start walking. A good thing we left before dawn, Anna said, stifling a yawn. She had a can of some cheap Russian Red Bull knockoff, some fluorescent green crap that smelled like chemicals. But she drank it as if it were the finest French wine. I gazed out at the dark forest that passed us on both sides, wondering what kind of sights lay ahead in this land of the forgotten. The sun rose early over the gently rolling hills and black earth of Ukraine, sending its rusty streaks of blood across the sky. The going had been easy so far, except for the constant car sickness that I felt. I took a few pills, wishing that I could have smuggled some weed gummies through customs. But here, cannabis was illegal and I wasn't eager to see the inside of an Eastern European prison, where lunatics like the 3 guys 1 hammer maniacs and the chessboard killer live in horrible conditions. Would you look at that? Dimitri said with awe and wonder oozing from his voice as the car braked abruptly. I looked up quickly, my stomach doing flips. But what I saw laying across the road instantly brought me back to the moment. Dimitri pointed a tattooed hand at the sight. Is that real? Anna asked. I could only shake my head as we all stared at the dead bear that was laying across the cracked road, its dead eyes staring straight through us. I noticed immediately that the bear had extra paws on its arms. Blood-stained claws jutted sharply out of its 4 paws, each seeming to have 7 fingers. Its feet looked stunted and twisted, like the roots of a tree. An extra arm stuck out of the front of its chest, a pale white fleshy growth emerging from its sternum. The mutated limb looked malformed and boneless, causing a sense of revulsion to rise up as I gazed on it. It flopped gently in the heavy wind that swirled down the surrounding hills. "Well, I guess the rumors are true," Dmitri said slowly, his eyes as wide and excited as a child. "Can you imagine what other kind of things must be lurking in these forests? This is going to make a really awesome documentary." Anna nodded, playing with the small handheld digital camera that she took everywhere with her. She wanted to make a video that would finally go viral on the internet and help her gain some recognition for her work. "I'm going to record everything, including this," she said excitedly, brushing a lock of blonde hair behind her ear as she opened the door of the car. Dawn had risen overhead, radiating the first warm rays of a bright summer day. After a long moment, I followed her out. Dmitri stood at her side, his dark eyes wide. He ran a trembling hand over his shaved head as he looked down at the enormous bear. Anna zoomed in with the camera, kneeling down before the still beast. Her finely formed fingers shook with excitement as she drew within inches of the corpse. I wondered how the bear had died, as I didn't see any signs of injuries on the creature's body. The next moment, I saw it blink. I backpedaled away, giving a hoarse, guttural shout of warning. Anna was busy staring at the screen of the digital camera, scanning it across the bear's extra fingers and limbs. But the panic that swept over Dmitri's face showed me that he too had seen it. He grabbed Anna's arm, dragging her back with a sudden fury. She stumbled, her legs crossing under her. She crashed into him and they fell back together. A moment later, the bear came to life, its bones cracking as it twisted its head to look at the three of us. It swiped a mutated paw at the place where Anna's face had been only a moment before. I heard the sharp claws slice through the air like switchblades. The bear's head ratcheted over to glare at us. It gnashed its teeth as silver streams of saliva flew from its shaking head. With a primal roar, it leapt off the ground. I turned to run back to the safety of the car, but I nearly tripped when a pale figure streaked out of the forest right in front of me. It looked like something conjured up in a nightmare. It was naked and bloated, its skin white with bulging pink cheeks. It looked to have a combination of human and pig features, and yet it ran upright like a person. Its irises were blood red and its pupils were huge and excited. Its beady eyes flickered over to Anna, and a low, satisfied growl erupted from its wide throat. I watched the muscles work furiously in its porcine body as it sprinted towards her. Before either Dmitri or I could react, the pig thing grabbed Anna around the neck, its sharp, black fingers digging deeply into her skin. She squealed like a strangled rabbit as it dragged her away into the dark forest. Its pink lips pulled back in an excited grimace, revealing the sharp fangs underneath. I could hear its growls fade away rapidly. It sprinted much faster than a person, its hooves slamming the ground over and over at a superhuman speed. "Hey!" Dmitri called out, taking a step forward. "What are you?" A giant bear paw with too many gleaming claws smacked his leg out from under him, sending him flying. I only stood there, shell-shocked, as Anna disappeared into the trees. A single moment later, the bear rose to its full height, roaring at us. Streams of spit flew from its mouth as its rancid breath washed over us, breath that emanated a smell like roadkill and infection. I put my hands up, flinching, expecting a blow that never came. When I looked up, the bear had gone back on all fours. It ran in the path the pig-like creature had gone, its white, boneless extra limb hanging limply from its chest. "What the heck?" Dmitri cried in the ground, rocking back and forth. I came back to life, running over to his side. I saw deep gouge marks sliced through his blue jeans. Bright streams of blood lazily dripped from the claw marks on his left leg. "We need to get help," I cried, shaking him. His eyes looked far away and confused, as if he didn't fully realize what was happening. "We need to go back and get the police." "The police?" he asked, laughing. "The police here won't do anything. You think they're going to travel out into the radioactivity zone just for a missing person?" He shook his head grimly before reaching out a hand to me. "Help me up. There's a first aid kit in the car. We need to bandage this up and then we're going after Anna." We had no way to call for help. The phones this far out in Chernobyl didn't work, and there were never any cell phone towers built in the silent land. After Dmitri had disinfected and bandaged up his legs, he rummaged through the trunk looking for any weapons. There's nothing good here," he said despondently. "Some bear mace, some knives. What good is any of that going to do against these mutated monsters? We need an AK." I nodded in agreement. "Too bad we're not in the US. I said, "The only guns you're going to get around here are the ones you'd take off the bodies of Russian soldiers." "Yeah, if only," he muttered sadly, handing me a large folding knife. "We have 1 canister of bear mace, 3 knives, and a tire iron. Not exactly an arsenal." I really didn't want to go into those dark woods, but thinking of what could be happening to Anna made me feel sick and weak. I shook my head, mentally torn. "Here, take the bear mace too. I'll take the tire iron and knife," he continued, forcing the black canister into my numb fingers. "You ready for this?" "Absolutely not. I think we should try to find help. If we both go out there and get slaughtered, nobody will ever find Anna anyway." "Well, the nearest town is 2 hours west of here. By the time we get help, her trail will have gone cold. It will take at least 5 or 6 hours to get any rescue out here. No, we need to do this, and we need to do it now. If you don't want to come." "I'll come," I said grimly, my heart pounding. "Screw it." Dmitri had a sad history. As a child living in Ukraine, he had been kidnapped by an insane neighbor and kept in a dirt pit outside for weeks, wallowing in his own waste and slowly starving. He said that the man would throw down a stale crust of bread or a rice cake into the mud every couple of days. Dmitri would pull the food out, wipe off the mess, and then eat it. I shuddered, remembering the horror stories that he had told me. I knew that he had a personal reason for making sure that Anna was not subjected to the same endless suffering, even if it meant his own death. The bear and the pig creature had left a clear trail of broken brush and snapped twigs snaking through the forest. Side by side, we moved cautiously ahead, constantly checking our backsides, but we saw no signs of movement and heard nothing. Up ahead, the trees abruptly opened up, letting golden sunlight stream down. Blinking quickly, we left the forest behind. We walked out into a field in the middle of a valley surrounded by tall, dark hills. Grass and weeds rippled in waves as the wind swept past us. Formed in a semicircle in front of us, human skeletons lay endlessly dreaming. They stared up into the vast blue sky with grinning skulls and empty sockets. Some still had putrefying strips of flesh and ligaments clinging to the bones. Animals had scattered some of the bodies, but others lay complete, like corpses in a tomb. Human skulls, leg bones, and arm bones lay scattered haphazardly across the field, their surfaces yellowed and cracked with age. It looked like a bone orchard. "What are we looking at right now?" I whispered, furtively glancing around at the field of bones. An insane part of my mind wondered if they might rise from the dead and come after us. Compared to what we had already seen in this place of nightmares, it didn't seem that far-fetched. "Bodies," Dmitri said grimly. "Victims of the nuclear accident?" I asked. He shook his head, pointing at some of the fresher corpses nearby. Their throats looked like they had been ripped out, their bones of their necks showing deep bite marks. The one nearest to us had its skeletal fingers wrapped around a glass bottle, with a piece of paper rolled inside and a cork inserted into the top. I knelt down, prying the fingers back with soft, cracking noises. I uncorked it and took out the paper. It felt thick in my hands like some kind of handcrafted paper from the old days. The cursive flowing across these sheets looked like it had been written in a quill pen with actual ink. In confusion, I read the letter aloud. Rules to survive the Hellskin Nature Preserve. 1. The cult known as the Golden Butchers have been kidnapping women to breed them with the pig creatures. They worship the offspring that result from these unions as gods. If a member of your group gets taken, you will find them in the living farm at the end of the forest. 2. If you encounter Mr. Welcome, the enormous pig god with the eyes on his forehead, you must not let him touch you. 3. The red snakes can only see you while you're moving. If you encounter them, stay still, don't even breathe. Breeding women with pig creatures. Dmitri cried, horror washing over his face. We need to find her, but where do we even start? I looked through the field, trying to see any sign of tracks, but it looked like hundreds of animals had gone through this field recently. Pathways of tall, crushed grass crisscrossed the enormous length of it, some of them worn down to black dirt and stones. I just shook my head, having no idea. A distant scream rolled its way down these surrounding hills. It came from our left and sounded very much like Anna. Dimitri's eyes turned cold. Without looking back at me, he started frantically running towards the sound. It faded away within seconds. "Wait up!" I cried, sprinting as fast as I could. His freshly shaved head gleamed as he disappeared into the trees. And gripping the open buck knife in my hand, my knuckles white with tension and fear, I followed after him. We wandered for hours through the woods, never hearing a second scream to guide our path. We both hoped that we were going in the right direction. A small deer trail winding through the brush opened up, heading up rocky hills and clear streams of water. Sweating and nervous, we traveled for miles and miles, rarely talking. A few times I tried to get Dmitri to slow down. "How do you know you're going in the right direction?" I asked. "We've been walking this trail for 5 hours and haven't seen a thing." "This was the direction the scream came from," he said weakly. "Where else would they go? They would want to travel quickly with a hostage. They would take a trail." I didn't point out that there may be other trails and that we had absolutely no idea where we were going. As we reached the peak of a mountain, I pulled a small portable Geiger counter that we had taken along for the trip. The radioactivity here was high, much higher than normal background radiation. I didn't know how far we were from the nuclear power plant at the center of all of this, but at a certain point it would become too dangerous to keep moving forward. Dmitri was next to me, chugging a bottle of water when a shriek rang out below us. It sounded almost animalistic but had a strange electronic distortion. Amplified to an ear-splitting cacophony, it echoed through the trees. Much quieter roars answered from the forest all around us in response, the cries of bears and other predators. These sounded much closer, however. "Psst," a pile of thick ferns said to my left, shaking suddenly. In Ukrainian, the ferns continued by whispering, "Hey you." I jumped, swinging the knife in the direction of the brush, watching the blade shake wildly in my hands as fresh waves of adrenaline surged through my body. Dmitri was by my side, his eyes wide and wild. He glanced over at me, nodding. He had the tire iron raised like a tennis racket, ready to strike. A moment later, a little boy crawled out. He was scarecrow thin, his face smudged with dirt and filth, his dark eyes sunken and lifeless deep inside his small head. He had black hair and a nose like a little twisted lump in the center of his face. It seemed like it had been repeatedly broken. He didn't look older than 10, but he looked so emaciated that it was impossible to say. The rags and tatters that he wore barely covered his body, and the boy was almost in his Genesis suit. "Come out," I said grimly. Dimitri's eyes bulged from his head. "Don't kill me, please," the boy whispered in a cracked and choked voice. "Take me out of here. My mom and dad brought me here. They were a part of the Golden Butchers. But a couple of months ago, they got sick and died from all the poison in the water and food." "Who are you, kid?" Dmitri said, reaching down and pulling him up to his feet. I watched the boy closely, the bear mace in one hand and the knife in the other, looking for any sign of sudden violence or betrayal. My name is Philip and I come from the farm, he said, pointing vaguely towards the tallest peak in the area. You can't see it from here, but it's over there. Dmitri kneeled down until he was eye to eye with Philip. Can you take us there? He said. Philip's eyes teared up, but he slowly nodded. If you will take me with you when you leave, then I'll show you, he said, crying now. But it's a horrible place. It's the place of Mr. Welcome. Philip guided us to the living farm, saving us a great deal of time. He navigated the forest like an experienced hiker, seeming to know the entire area from the smallest clues. A split, fallen tree, or a tree with a whirl like an eye, or a sudden curve in a babbling brook. It saved us a great deal of time wandering through the woods, where everything looked exactly the same to me. There, he said, pointing through a break in the trees to the farm. The entire top of the hill was cleared of trees and brush. In its place stood a nightmare. The farm was the closest place to Hades that I've ever seen. The top of the living building peeked over the tall trees surrounding it. It had something like a bell tower on top of it, almost like a church might have. But instead of a bell, it had an enormous, bloodshot eye. Its eye had an iris as red as a dismembered heart. Its pupil was dilated and insane. From here, the eye looked to be about the size of a church bell and had no eyelids. Strange white filaments like those of a slime mold surrounded it, trailing down into the building. I wondered if this was the optic nerve for the great staring eye. The rest of the building was as black as eternity, windowless and imposing. It had a brutalist architecture, all sharp angles and steep slopes. I watched the building and the eye closely. To my horror, I realized that the entire thing was alive somehow. The eye constantly spun in its place, staring out over the surrounding hills like the eye of Sauron. The building constantly breathed, "Welcome." A hushed, distorted voice cried. The words seemed to come from the breathing and living walls of the farm itself. "Welcome, welcome." What the heck is this kid? Dmitri whispered hoarsely. Where's Anna at? Philip shook his head sadly. She's inside with the other breeders, he said, and the fear and terror became evident on his face. They keep them chained up or bound in the basement until the time for the ritual comes. And when is that? I asked. He looked up at the sky and the fading light. We had somehow wasted nearly an entire day already. Night was coming and we hadn't even seen Annie yet. At sunset, he responded. Dmitri nearly jumped at that. Sunset, that's almost here, we need to go now, he cried. I almost wanted to laugh. What are you going to do, stab that enormous building with your knife? I whispered. We need a plan, maybe we can burn it down or... But my words were cut off by the roaring of the building. Its screams echoed over the hills, and it was immediately answered by countless others, including one that came only a few dozen feet behind us. I grabbed at Dimitri's shoulder, my panicked eyes flicking in that direction. There's something, I started to say when the brush cracked under a heavy weight. Looking up, I saw something horrible stalking us from behind. It looked like a pig walking on all fours with a fat and bloated body, but it was the size of an SUV. Its eyes were like the eye in the building, blood red and dilated. All over its body, hundreds of sharp teeth grew out of its skin, covering the pink flesh like tumors. The creature almost looked like a porcupine with all the sharp points of fangs projecting from its body. For a moment, its eyes widened as we stared at each other. They instantly narrowed as the pig roared again and gave chase. It gnashed its teeth, opening and closing its mouth in a frenzy of bloodlust. In its mouth, too, the teeth grew wild. Hundreds of razor-sharp teeth of different sizes grew from its gums, tongue, and lips. "Run," I cried, grabbing Philip's arm and hauling him off the ground. The boy had a natural survivor's instinct and immediately started running by my side, away from the approaching creature. We broke out into the massive clearing where the living farm stood. I saw that the building had only a single door in and out, a black barn door that stood wide open. I heard Dimitri's feet pounding the ground behind me. The heavy thuds of the approaching creature drew louder by the second. "In the barn," I cried, not having time to think. It was the only possible place of safety here. I sprinted faster than I ever had before towards those doors as if they were the entrance to paradise itself. Without slowing, I ran into the building trying to slam one of the doors shut behind me. Dimitri grabbed the other. With the creature only seconds away, they started swinging shut. Philip's small body pressed against my leg as he came forward, using his meager strength to help me. The door was extremely heavy and hard to move. The building itself looked like it was 6 or 7 stories tall, and the doors to the barn nearly a third of that height. With a tortured creak, they slammed shut. A single breath later, something heavy thudded against the other side, as if it had been hit by a battering ram, but the door held. Quickly, Dimitri and I grabbed a large board leaning against the wall and stuffed it into the brackets on both sides of the door, locking it from the inside. I noticed how cool and dark it was in here, as if I had walked into a cave. I turned, taking in the interior of the living farm for the first time. At that moment, I had to repress a scream welling up in my throat. Hundreds of prisoners lined both sides of the barn. They were stacked one on top of another like prison cells. Wearing filthy rags, most of them looked silently down on us with dead and haunted eyes. I noticed the majority were in their 20s or 30s, but their eyes looked centuries old. Along the back wall, an enormous pig lined the wall, positioned like Jesus on the cross. It stood as tall as the barn itself. Extra eyes covered its face, a dozen of them positioned all over its cheeks and forehead. From the top of its head, I saw white filaments rising up into the bell tower. Its many blood-red eyes focused on us as still as death. "Welcome," it hissed. "Welcome." Its limbs were chained to the wall. Enormous rusted links intertwined around its body, preventing Mr. Welcome from moving. "Anna," Dimitri cried, looking around frantically. There was no one else here that I could see except for Mr. Welcome and all the hostages. "Anna, where are you?" "Don't scream," Philip said in a tiny, fear-choked voice. "Please don't scream." But it was too late. As Dimitri's last words faded, trapdoors built into the black floor of the barn sprung open. Dozens of mutated bears and pig creatures crept out, their predatory eyes scanning us with hunger and anger. "Crap," Dimitri cried, running back to the door at my side. Frantically, the three of us pulled the board up and dropped it to the fleshy floor with a clatter. As hisses and growls erupted all around us and the predators creeped forward towards us in a semicircle, the barn door flew open. It was nighttime now, and the darkness was creeping in like a descending curtain. No pig creatures awaited us on the other side, but something worse seemed to be creeping out of the forest. I saw snakes the color of clotted blood slithering ahead. Each one was the size of a tractor trailer, yet they made very little noise. An occasional hiss would rip its way through the air, but they hunted silently. As I stood in the field in front of the barn, a no man's land, the certainty of death fell over my heart like grasping skeletal hands. I looked down at the little boy sadly. He gave me a faint smile, even though his eyes were terrified. "I think we're screwed," Dimitri whispered by my side. I only nodded. But at that moment, I remembered the rules and an idea came to me. "Just stay still, don't even breathe." Philip and Dimitri looked at me strangely, and then recognition came over their eyes. Dimitri only nodded, and then we all played statue. The predators from the barn were only 30 feet behind us by now, crouched down and hunting like a cat with a mouse. Yet the snakes also closed in, their black, slitted eyes gleaming with a reptilian coldness, as the mutated bears and pig creatures leaned down to pounce. I closed my eyes waiting for the inevitable. I felt a sudden rush of air all around me. The snakes flitted forward in a blur, their massive jaws unhinging. Two fangs swiveled out like switchblades, fangs big enough to impale a police car. Drops of clear venom fell lazily from the ends. Keeping my eyes closed, afraid to even breathe or blink, I listened as these sounds of tearing flesh and screaming animals resonated all around me. After about 30 seconds of this, everything went deathly silent. I don't know how long we stood there like statues, but eventually somebody touched my shoulder. I opened my eyes, unbelieving, and Dimitri stared at me intently. "They're all gone," he whispered. "All except for Mr. Welcome. It's now or never." I nodded, and together we moved into the farm. The trapdoors still lay open, and I could hear very faint sobbing coming from under the building. Dimitri was afraid to make a sound. Together, the three of us went down to investigate. We found a dark basement covered in hay, tools covered the walls, iron maidens, brazen bowls, crosses, and an entire universe of saws, grinders, pliers, razor wire, and other tools of the trade. In the corner, we saw Anna, her hands tied to the wall. More rope bound her feet and legs. We ran forward. When Anna saw Dimitri, she collapsed into a nervous wreck. "Oh my God, you came for me. Please get me out of here right now." "They're coming. The ritual's going to start soon." Without a word, we started cutting the ropes, freeing her quickly. "We need to be as quiet as possible," I told Anna. "We can all get out of here, let's hope." As we ascended from the basement back to the main floor of the living farm, the repetitive, metallic voice of Mr. Welcome kept repeating the same insane mantra. "Welcome. Welcome." Once the four of us were all together, however, it changed. "Welcome, thieves," it hissed, its voice deepening and turning into a demonic gurgle. "That's my breeder. You will have to find out what happens to thieves." I could only imagine all those tools in the basement, and I shuddered. Mr. Welcome inhaled deeply, his massive fleshy body ballooning. With a predatory roar, he ripped the chains out of the wall of the living building. Orange pus and dark clotted blood dripped from the holes. The barn breathed faster and deeper, the broken walls vibrating and shimmering as new life and pain flowed into them. Mr. Welcome started moving towards us like a grinding juggernaut, walking on two legs like some sort of pig god. His many lidless eyes never looked away from us. The frayed optic nerves leading to the bell tower broke with a sound like snapping rubber bands. Dimitri looked at me with a great sadness in his eyes. "Get away," he whispered. "All distracted. Just get Anna home no matter what." Before I could respond, he ran forward towards the abomination, the small useless knife raised in one hand. Mr. Welcome saw him coming. He tried to swipe at Dimitri with a sharp black hoof, but Dimitri ducked, running around to the back of him. He gave a battle cry and started stabbing the monster in the back of the leg, which probably hurt it about as much as a toothpick, but it provided a distraction. This time Mr. Welcome spun his whole body, falling back to all four legs to deal with this nuisance. He used his massive snout to smack Dimitri hard, sending him flying across the barn. He hit the wall with a bone-shattering thud. Dimitri's skin immediately started to blacken as if he were being burned alive. His eyes melted out of his face as he screamed, clawing at the dying patches of tissue spreading across his body. Within a few seconds, his screams faded to agonized groans. He tried to crawl back towards us as he died. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Anna's hand and forcing her to sprint by my side. Philip was already one step ahead of us, frantically trying to reach the shelter of the forest. I heard the ground shake behind me as Mr. Welcome drew near, moving much faster than we could ever hope to go. I knew that we would never make it. Keep going no matter what, I yelled at Philip and Anna. They kept running, the animal instinct to survive now foremost in their minds. I had to suppress mine. I turned to face the creature, the evil pig god known as Mr. Welcome. In hindsight, I don't know if God or some divine power had interceded, but the bear mace was probably one of the few items that could have saved us at that moment. Mr. Welcome had many eyes, and now that he was running on all four paws, his face was within reach. As my heart palpitated wildly, I raised the bear mace and sprayed it at his dozen eyes. He didn't slow, and I had to jump to the side to keep from being trampled. The air whooshed past me as if a subway car had gone by. But a moment later, Mr. Welcome gave a roar, and not one of anger or hunger. This was a roar of pain and uncertainty. Blinded, Mr. Welcome frantically started running in circles, knocking down huge swaths of trees. The ear-splitting racket as he pulled the forest apart crashed over the surrounding landscape. Without a moment of hesitation, I turned to follow Philip and Anna back to the car. We told the police about the barn and all the hostages, but they claimed that they couldn't find it, and we never heard anything more about it. Looking back on the experience, I now know why Chernobyl is a restricted zone, and it isn't just because of the radioactivity. There are some things that hide under the surface after all, things that grow in the dark, rotted places where no eyes roam. I lost my job a couple of months ago when the entire business that I worked for abruptly went bankrupt and shut down. To make ends meet, I started driving for Uber late into the night. It was about 3:30 or 4 in the morning when I made the last drop-off on the night that it happened. The passenger was a strange, quiet man with a greasy t-shirt. His brown eyes looked flat and dead. I glanced into the rearview mirror as I dropped him off at a Victorian house in the middle of nowhere, making sure he left my car so that he could wander off and wear a mask made of human skin or whatever people like that did on their days off. The house looked like it was something from a horror movie, all sharp turrets and dark windows with a blood-red exterior. Dawn came early that day, a cancerous orange sky looming overhead. Needles of rain abruptly started falling sideways. Tired and hungry, I kept an eye out for somewhere to stop and eat as I drove through the filthy torrents of rain. I turned on the GPS for my apartment and sped through the dirty, empty streets of Frost Hollow. Dark, dead trees rose overhead on both sides of me. I drove on for a few minutes, seeing only a single house far back at the beginning of the road that entire time. I didn't know this area, so I was pleasantly surprised when a brightly lit diner appeared on my left. A blinking sign cheerfully read, "Happy's Restaurant." The parking lot was entirely empty except for a truck that looked like it had been there for weeks. Leaves and dirt covered its windshield, and somebody had written, "Clean me" in the grime in giant letters. I heaved a deep yawn as I pulled into the parking lot. I tried to check my phone, but there was no internet or service all the way out here. I hoped that they had Wi-Fi in the diner. Happy's Restaurant had enormous plate glass windows wrapping around the sides and front of the restaurant. Light burst out onto the dark parking lot in harsh white streams as birds chirped in the forests around me, waking up to the new dawn. The architecture of the place looked straight out of the 1950s. I could imagine James Dean going there and chain-smoking cigarettes over a burger and a coffee. I got out of the car, heading over to the front of the restaurant where I lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply. The spicy menthol tobacco gave me a sudden jolt of energy. Blinking quickly, I smoked the cigarette as quickly as I could, feeling wide awake by the end of it. I stood under the canopy of the building, watching lightning erupt like missile flashes across the sky. The street remained dead and empty. I hadn't seen a single other person since I had dropped off the weirdo at the nearby Victorian house. I opened the glass door of the diner, hearing a bell ring overhead. I looked into the empty restaurant, seeing its sparkling clean tables. The smell of fresh coffee rose out in fragrant waves. Shrugging, I went down and sat at a table next to a TV in the corner. It was playing some 24-hour news channel, talking about a mass breakout in a nearby mental asylum. 2 patients of the Grey Path Psychiatric Hospital were able to break out by murdering a doctor and taking a nurse hostage. They had apparently planned the attack for weeks, making homemade knives out of screws taken out of the walls and other contraband that went undetected. The facility is considered a maximum security hospital, with the majority of patients considered criminally insane and held until... Hey, sorry bud, didn't see you there. A voice called out from the back of the empty restaurant. I jumped, turning to see who was speaking. A man came out in a streaked, dirty apron. He was incredibly fat, probably at least 300 or 400 pounds. 4 greasy chins hung down on his neck like the wattles of a rooster. He reminded me of a circus freak, a slug-like man whose heavy footsteps shook the ground as he approached my table. He had red hands like a butcher, and his face too was beet red and covered in sweat, with a tiny nose in the middle and giant rubbery lips. His name tag said, Frank. Morning, he mumbled. What can I get for you? Our waiter never showed up, so I'm the only guy in here. I'll have to take your order and cook it if that's okay. I nodded happily. Yeah, that's fine. I just want a coffee with extra cream and sugar and a Reuben with fries and an extra side of coleslaw. He wrote it down on a dirt-streaked pad and he pulled from his apron, taking a very long time and writing as slowly as possible. I watched his face closely. He reminded me of a clown, but his eyes were gray, the color of steel. They seemed freezing cold, almost inhuman. There was nothing clownish about them. Okay, bud, that'll be right up, he said, grinning down at me. His yellowed teeth were covered in a thick layer of filmy grime. I noticed that some in front were broken, as if he had a habit of getting his teeth knocked out in fights. He turned around, heading back into the kitchen in his strange, waddling gait. I wondered how Frank had gotten here. There was certainly no public transportation anywhere in this part of the state, but I figured he must have gotten dropped off. I looked down at my phone, hoping to find an open Wi-Fi connection to pass the time, but there was nothing here. Sighing, I looked around the restaurant. A creepy clown mannequin stood in the corner holding a sign that read, "Be happy, eat those feelings away." Its red and white makeup was all sharp points and hard angles. Around its grinning mouth, the red paint formed into a pointed half circle, accentuating the gleaming white teeth that shone between its thin lips. A few moments later, Fred came out with a steaming hot cup of coffee and a bowl of creamers and sugar packets. He plopped them down in front of me, grunting and ambling back towards the kitchen. I smelled the odor of roasting meat and cooking oil rising from the kitchen in delicious, aromatic waves. I couldn't wait for my Reuben. Out of all the sandwiches in the history of sandwiches, I thought Reubens were probably the most delicious. The way the corned beef mixed with the Thousand Island dressing, the sauerkraut, and marble rye bread made it seem like those ingredients were made by God specifically to make such a divine sandwich. My stomach growled as I waited eagerly. I continued scanning the restaurant, listening to the hum of the TV next to me, when I spotted what looked like splatters of blood in front of these swinging kitchen doors. I used to work in a restaurant when I was a teenager, a crappy little pizza place, and I remembered how the ground beef always came soaked in wet blood. I found it odd that nobody had cleaned it up yet, though. It looked dried and clotted as if it had been there for days. The TV was still talking about the escaped mental patients when Frank brought out a giant plate of delicious, fragrant sandwich and golden fries. I could feel my mouth watering as he laid it down with a clunk on the table in front of me. "Enjoy, buddy," he said, giving me a sly wink. His fish-like lips formed into a faint half-smile. He turned away and I immediately dug in. The Reuben was probably the best Reuben I've ever tasted. The corned beef was perfectly cooked, the bread crisp and fresh. The fries were golden and had a nice satisfying crunch. I wanted to compliment Frank, but he was nowhere to be seen. Shrugging, I finished off the first half of my sandwich. As I got to the last bite, I noticed something odd and crunchy in the meat. I thought it was a coin or something at first. I immediately spit out the entire wad of half-chewed sandwich onto a napkin looking down. In the middle of the meat sat a painted human fingernail. It was ripped off, the bottom jagged and sharp. At that moment, I felt a sudden urge to vomit. I sat there for a few seconds, simply staring, my mind racing in circles like a rat in a wheel. Was it a fake fingernail? How had it gotten into my sandwich? I picked it up, bringing it closer to my right eye. I saw black, clotted blood and thin strands of flesh still hanging from the bottom. It was definitely not fake. Rising quickly, I grabbed my car keys and phone off the table and started stumbling towards the door. There were no rational thoughts at that moment, just an insistent rising sense of panic and dread. That was the moment the lights at the diner cut out. An eerie, gurgling laugh floated out of the kitchen. The cancerous yellow light of the new day was filtering through the stormy clouds. I looked through the plate glass front door and saw a face peering in with wide, insane eyes. I recognized the man that I had dropped off at the Victorian house down the road. He had carved a fresh question mark into his forehead sometime after I had last seen him. His face looked slack and empty as he stared inside, his dead blank eyes roaming left and right, looking for someone, looking for me. In his right hand, I saw an enormous meat cleaver streaked with fresh, dripping blood. He raised a trembling left hand and started opening the door. In the darkness and silence of the diner, I could hear every sound amplified 1,000-fold, every drop of rain hitting the roof, every thudding beat of my heart, every tiny creaking of the door as it swung open. I heard the doors to the kitchen swinging open at the same moment. In terror, I frantically looked around, seeing the bathrooms only a few feet away in the corner of the restroom. As silently as I could, I slunk towards them, afraid to look back. I ripped open the woman's restroom door, peeking out as I closed it behind me. I could see the man holding the meat cleavers slowly creeping past the tables, bending over to check underneath them. I could hear him whispering to himself, "I must baptize them in the blood and send them out into the world. Must find the blood, eat the body, drink the blood to see God." Silently, I closed the door and groped around in the dark until I found the lock. Inhaling deeply, I clicked it to the side. The subtle clicking noise seemed as loud as a gunshot in the silence. I took my cell phone out of my pocket and turned, seeing a scene from a nightmare. Corpses littered the floor of the bathroom. A waitress in a button-up vest sat up against the wall in a corner. She looked to be in her mid-20s with dark brown eyes, black hair and pale, creamy skin. Dozens of stab wounds gleamed in her chest and stomach. Her neck had been so deeply slashed that her head had nearly been decapitated. Even worse, I saw chunks of flesh cut out of her body. Chunks from the meat of her cheeks, arms, legs, and fingers. I suddenly had a very good idea of where that fingernail had come from and what I had been eating. I gagged, retching. Next door sprawled the corpse of an old man in a business suit. His shirt and jacket had been ripped off, and a giant question mark had been carved deeply into the loose skin of his bird-like chest. Stuck in one eye, I saw the gleam of a wicked butcher's knife. It had sliced the eye in half, the blade disappearing deeply into his brain and skull. The other eye stared glassily up at the ceiling. I heard a light tapping at the bathroom door, a kind of polite knocking that somebody might use if they were wondering if it was occupied. I was afraid to breathe. I spun, looking at the wooden door, the only thing standing between me and the certain death at this moment. "Is anyone in there?" a low, raspy voice asked, the same voice that had mumbled about drinking blood. "Occupado." "Hey, question mark. What the heck are you doing?" the gruff voice of Frank asked. "Did you find him?" His tone rose into one of utter excitement, like a child on his way to Disneyland. "The bathroom's locked," question mark replied. "I think we've got a little lamb in there ready for the slaughter." "Ready for the grill, you mean?" Frank said, giving an insane laugh that reminded me of the coldness of empty space. I turned, running over to the old man's body. The game was up, I knew. I wrapped my hands around the sticky, blood-coated handle of the butcher's knife. I started pulling up, but it was firmly implanted in the old man's skull. At that moment, I heard a sound that sent waves of terror dancing up my spine, the sound of keys jingling in a lock. A rush of adrenaline made the world brighten and my vision turned white in the harsh glare of the phone's light. I laid the phone down on the top of the toilet and with all my strength, I yanked up on the knife. There was a cracking noise and then a wet sucking sound, as cold blood sprayed my face and neck. The knife slipped out in a rush, sending me flying back. At that moment, the door flew open and Frank and Question Mark stood there side by side, two grinning lunatics with knives in their hands. The orange light from the sunrise dimly illuminated their silhouettes. They looked over to where the cell phone lay on the toilet, not seeing me leaning against the back wall, breathing heavily in an animal panic. Before they had time to react, I ran forwards, the blade facing out towards my attackers. Question Mark turned towards me at the last second as I brought the knife into his throat. It sliced easily. His eyes widened in pain and surprise as he gurgled, choking on his own blood. He tried to bring the meat cleaver up, but his foot slipped on the slick blood coating the floor. I yanked the knife back out, turning to Frank. I saw the flash of metal and felt something pierce deeply into the side of my stomach. A roaring pain like acid burned its way through my flesh. Screaming as warm spurts of red shot from the wound, I ran at Frank with the last of my energy, stabbing upwards into his belly. We fell into each other, both critically injured. The blood burst from his ruptured artery, spurting like a fire hose with each rapid beat of his heart. His eyes rolled up in his head and fell back, landing on the corpse of Question Mark. Staggering and leaning against the wall, I tried making my way towards the front of the store, but I felt the energy draining out of me like water through a sieve. Waves of agony crashed through my body, taking my breath away. I collapsed onto my knees, crawling slowly towards salvation. Frothy bubbles of red flowed over my lips as I coughed, choking. I heard sirens in the distance, approaching rapidly. It sounded like dozens of police cars were heading in our direction. Screaming and crying, I dragged myself towards the front door, leaving warm streaks of blood smeared across the restaurant floor. The gurgling death gasp of Frank rattled noisily behind me. I could feel my life draining out of the deep stab wound in the side of my stomach. As I reached the door, police cars came into the restaurant parking lot with a screeching of tires. Men began running out with their guns drawn. The world went black as I reached up towards the door, wanting only to get out of this restaurant and never see this town again. I woke up in the hospital a couple of days later. Emergency surgery had stopped the bleeding and many blood transfusions had saved my life. Police were waiting around my bed as I regained consciousness, frantic to ask me questions. I told them that I didn't know anything, that I had just stopped at the restaurant to get a bite to eat and I'd gotten attacked. We had gotten multiple missing persons reports over the last couple of weeks, the gruff homicide detective with a face like a bulldog said. But we didn't connect the victims to the diner until the day that we found you there. Both of the escaped patients are dead though, thanks to you. He patted me on the shoulder. I shook my head too wary to respond. If only they had investigated sooner, I could have avoided this entire nightmare. But then again, I wouldn't have tasted the best Reuben sandwich in the universe either.